The phone rang like a gunshot in the dead of night too. 3 a.m. I was wide awake before the second ring. At first, I thought it was a national emergency. Maybe something at the Justice Department. Maybe a federal crisis. When you're the U.S. Attorney General, your sleep is light and your instincts sharper. But the voice on the other end wasn't from a federal agency or one of my security advisors. It was my daughter, Emma, and she was crying. "Dad," she choked out, barely holding it together. "I'm in jail, please. I need help." My world slowed down, my heart slamming so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Emma, what happened? Are you hurt?" "The HOA president, she had me arrested. She says I attacked the gatehouse." Her voice cracked, raw with panic. "They say I could go to prison. 10 years. I was already out of bed, grabbing clothes with one hand and my phone with the other, barking orders to my driver to meet me out front in 5. I was still trying to process it. My daughter, in jail, facing a decade in prison. For what? She was disabled, born with cerebral palsy. Emma couldn't walk, couldn't even stand, and needed a wheelchair to get around. She had some speech issues, sure, but she was brilliant, brave, kind. She'd never even been in a fistfight in her life, let alone committed a crime. The idea that she'd been arrested at night, alone, terrified, was surreal. I had dealt with terrorists, cartels, organized crime, but nothing had ever hit me like hearing my daughter cry from behind cold steel bars. Emma had always been the strong one. Even as a child, she faced every challenge with stubborn optimism. She never asked for pity, never wanted special treatment. She just wanted to live, to be seen as capable. And now, instead of celebrating her first taste of independence, she was behind bars because someone decided she didn't belong. As I rushed to the car, my mind spiraled between panic and fury. She had only recently moved into her own place, a modest one-bedroom apartment in an upscale gated community called Sunset Valley. She had worked part-time for years, saved every penny, and with a mix of loans and scholarships from her university, she made it happen. I was so proud of her. It was supposed to be a new chapter, her first real step into adult life. I knew about the HOA in Sunset Valley. Most neighborhoods have one, but this one was notorious. Rigid rules, petty complaints, power-hungry leadership. I had met people like them in court, people who twisted policy into a weapon. But Emma had insisted on living there because the place had a wheelchair-accessible unit close to her campus. "Dad," she had told me with a grin months ago, "I can do this. I'll be okay." And now this. My driver pulled up and we sped into the night, my jaw clenched so tightly I thought my teeth would break. I dialed her lawyer as the city blurred past the windows. Every second she spent in that cell was a second too long. Whatever happened, one thing was already certain: Margaret Richardson, the HOA president, had made the biggest mistake of her life. She had no idea whose daughter she was messing with. Emma had only lived in Sunset Valley for a few months, but that was long enough to draw the ire of Margaret Richardson. According to Emma, she was the self-declared queen of the community. Rigid, sharp-tongued, and obsessed with enforcing every minor regulation with iron authority. It started with petty things. Complaints about the wheelchair ramp that Emma had installed with proper permits. Notes left on her door about her van's parking position, even though it was clearly marked as handicap accessible. Snide comments about keeping the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. Emma had laughed it off at first, trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. "She's just old school," she told me once. Or maybe she's just cranky. But over time, the complaints grew more aggressive, and Emma began to feel like a target. A few neighbors even whispered about how Richardson had driven out another resident last year for putting up holiday lights that weren't uniform. But this was different. This wasn't about lights or lawns, this was about Emma's right to exist. A disabled woman living independently was, apparently, too much for Margaret to tolerate. And that night, it came to a head. Emma had a late class that evening. She was studying environmental science and had spent the evening in the lab. Tired but focused, she made her way home around 8:00 p.m., navigating her usual route through the community's handicap, accessible entrance, the only one she could use. But waiting for her at the gatehouse was Margaret Richardson, arms crossed, jaw set, like a prison guard about to deny entry. Emma had told me before how Richardson sometimes stared her down when she came home late. But this time, she confronted her directly, told her the entrance was closed, claimed it was daytime use only. When Emma tried to explain, Margaret refused to move, physically blocked her with her own body, trapping her in place. My daughter was stranded, tired, alone, and denied access to her own home. She tried to go around her, but her wheelchair got tangled with the old gate mechanism. When she reversed to free herself, the structure jolted slightly. That's when Margaret screamed, accusing Emma of attacking the gatehouse. Then she called the police. Everything else spiraled from there. Witnesses, likely coached or misled, came forward. The HOA president spun a story of a violent, aggressive young woman who deliberately damaged property and threatened her. And no one, not the police, not the prosecutor, not the judge who signed the holding order, bothered to ask how a young woman in a wheelchair could possibly be the threat in that scenario. I felt like I was staring into a funhouse mirror version of justice. Everything twisted, everything backwards. But the more they pushed this absurd case, the clearer one thing became: they weren't just going after Emma. They were attacking what she represented: strength, independence, and the unwillingness to be quietly pushed aside. And they had no idea that this time, they had picked the wrong girl. Because behind her, she had me. Sunset Valley was the kind of place that looked perfect on a postcard: neatly trimmed hedges, pristine sidewalks, and identical homes lined up like obedient soldiers. But behind that polished surface was a world tightly ruled by the HOA, and at the center of it all stood Margaret Richardson. If Sunset Valley was a kingdom, she was its self-appointed monarch. She wielded the HOA handbook like scripture, weaponizing policies to bend the community to her will. Emma had heard about Margaret before she moved in. Other tenants whispered about her obsession with order, her rigid obsession with rules, her passive-aggressive emails sent at midnight about overgrown grass or unapproved porch furniture. But Emma had never expected that her disability would become the rule Margaret decided to fight hardest against. The moment Emma moved in, things started going wrong. At first, it was subtle. She found a notice taped to her door complaining about the placement of her wheelchair ramp, even though the ramp had been professionally installed, fully permitted, and legally required. Then came the ticket left on her windshield for parking too far into the curb, even though the spot was clearly marked as handicap only. Margaret claimed it was about safety, but Emma knew better. The ramp ruined the symmetry of the entrance. Her wheelchair, accessible van, took up too much space. The way she maneuvered her chair was too loud. It wasn't about rules, it was about control. And Margaret didn't like things she couldn't control. Emma told me about the strange looks she got from neighbors who'd been friendly before they saw Margaret whispering in their ears. Doors that used to be held open for her now stayed shut. Friendly nods turned to awkward glances. The isolation grew, and so did Margaret's complaints, each one more bizarre than the last. One week, Emma was accused of damaging the landscaping because her wheelchair tires left faint marks in the grass near the sidewalk. Another time, she was cited for creating a disturbance after returning home from the grocery store at 7:30 p.m. She wasn't playing loud music, she wasn't yelling, she was just existing. And apparently, to Margaret, that was too much. Emma had tried to handle it on her own at first. She filed quiet responses with the HOA board, always polite, always supported by documentation. She even asked to meet with Margaret to clear the air, but Margaret refused, told her everything she needed to know was in the community handbook, told her to stop acting like an exception. Emma never told me how much it hurt. Not until the night it all went too far. That night, she came home late after a long lab session. She was tired. The kind of tired that settles deep into your bones. The only thing she wanted was to get back to her apartment, take off her shoes, and rest. But as she reached the community's only wheelchair-accessible gate, Margaret was already there, arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line. Emma slowed her chair, confused. Margaret didn't move, didn't smile, didn't say hello. She just pointed at the gate and said, "You can't use this entrance after 6. Those are the rules." Emma blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. "There's no curfew for the wheelchair gate," she replied. "It's an accessibility feature, not a convenience. I live here." Margaret's face didn't budge. "Rules are rules. You're late. Use the main entrance." Emma felt her stomach drop. The main entrance had stairs, 7 concrete steps, no ramp. She'd never been able to use it. She tried explaining that. She even pulled up the Americans with Disabilities Act on her phone and showed Margaret the federal requirement for 24/7 accessible entrances. Margaret sneered and said, "This isn't a federal building. This is a private community. We have our own standards, and frankly, if you can't follow them, maybe this isn't the right place for you." Emma felt trapped. Her apartment was just 100 feet away, but it might as well have been 100 miles. She asked Margaret to move, politely, twice. But Margaret stood firm, now openly blocking the narrow passageway with her body. Emma tried to remain calm. She knew that drill-disabled people are always expected to be calm, composed, non-threatening, even when they're being mistreated. But the anger and humiliation were bubbling inside her. She tried to edge her chair past Margaret, turning slightly to avoid contact, but the chair's wheel caught the edge of the old gate mechanism. The entire structure gave a creak. Nothing broke. Nothing cracked, but it shifted, and that's when Margaret exploded. She screamed that Emma had rammed the gatehouse, that she was attacking community property. And then, with theatrical flair, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. The police arrived before Emma could even process what was happening. Margaret met them with the poise of a victim rehearsed in performance. She cried, said she feared for her safety, said Emma had threatened her, claimed she had been deliberately targeted by someone who thought being in a wheelchair meant she could get away with anything. The officers approached Emma with caution, one hand near his belt, asking her to calm down, even though she hadn't raised her voice once. She tried to explain, but Margaret kept interrupting, accusing, pointing at the gatehouse as if it were a crime scene. The officers looked at each other. Then they arrested her. They handcuffed my daughter, a young woman with cerebral palsy, and left her sitting in her wheelchair on the cold pavement for nearly 20 minutes while they wrote up the charges. Destruction of property, aggravated assault, verbal threats. It didn't matter that none of it made sense. It didn't matter that no reasonable person would believe she could have attacked anyone with a 200-pound metal chair she couldn't even lift. What mattered was the image Margaret had painted. A troublemaker, a rule-breaker, a dangerous outlier. And to the system, that was enough. Emma said nothing as they loaded her into the police van. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there, stunned, humiliated, wondering how doing nothing more than coming home had turned into a crime. When I arrived at the jail, I expected shock, but I wasn't prepared for the hollow, broken look in her eyes. She was sitting in a holding cell, her wrists bruised from the cuffs, still wearing her university sweatshirt and jeans. Her backpack containing her laptop, class notes, and lab material sat abandoned in the corner. She didn't look up at first, but when she did, the first word out of her mouth shattered me. "Dad," she said. I didn't do anything. I knelt beside her wheelchair, reached through the bars and held her hand. I told her I knew. I told her I believed her. I told her we'd fight this. But inside, I was on fire, because I wasn't just staring at my daughter. I was staring at a system that had failed her, a system that saw her not as a person, but as a problem. And I swore right then and there that I would burn that system down to the foundation, if that's what it took to bring her justice. The next morning, I sat with Emma's attorney in a private conference room at the county courthouse. The air was stiff with tension, the kind that only forms when something is so absurd, it borders on dangerous. Attorney Helen Garcia was sharp, seasoned, and just as outraged as I was. She had already reviewed the police report, the witness statements, and the so-called evidence Margaret Richardson and the HOA had managed to scrape together. And the more we dug into it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a case of neighborhood squabbles gone too far. It was a strategic, deliberate campaign to frame my daughter as a violent criminal using her disability as both the weapon and the motive. "She's not just pressing charges," Helen said, pacing with the file in hand. "She's constructing a narrative, and the local prosecutor, he's buying it." Margaret Richardson had provided 3 witness statements. 3, all from neighbors on the HOA board, all echoing each other word for word, as if copied from a template. Each one claimed to have seen Emma aggressively accelerate her wheelchair toward the gatehouse. One even claimed she yelled threats about making people pay. And then there was the video. The infamous video evidence that Margaret insisted showed Emma ramming the gatehouse with intent. But when Helen played the footage, I had to sit down from how ridiculous it was. Grainy, blurry, no audio, and all it captured was Emma trying to gently maneuver her chair through a narrow spacer wheel getting caught, her hand reaching down to dislodge it, and the gatehouse giving the slightest wobble, the kind of motion that wouldn't register if you sneezed too hard next to it. That was their smoking gun. Yet the prosecutor, a young man named Davis with slicked back hair and too much ambition in his voice, was eager to turn this into a statement case. We're seeing more and more instances where individuals claim disability as an excuse for bad behavior, he said almost proudly during our initial meeting. This isn't just about property damage, it's about intent, about respect for the law. I stared at him long and hard. Intent? Emma's only intent that night was to go home. Respect for the law? I am the law. And I couldn't believe I was having to argue the basics of disability rights to someone who had passed the bar. But Davis didn't care about facts. He cared about optics. He had a tough-on-crime platform to build, and Emma was his perfect example of the grey area. Someone who looked innocent, whose disability might garner sympathy, but who could, in his words, still be dangerous under the right circumstances. I wanted to tear that logic apart in the middle of his office, but I didn't. Not yet. I had to play this carefully, because every reaction I gave would be measured, documented, and possibly weaponized against Emma. So I nodded. I let him talk. I let him believe I was just a concerned father trying not to make waves. But inside, I was already planning how to rip his arguments to shreds in court. The preliminary hearing arrived faster than expected. Word of the case had spread through the community like wildfire. Half of Sunset Valley showed up to watch. The courtroom was packed with residents, reporters, curious locals, and HOA members whispering amongst themselves. Some had come to support Emma, people who knew her from the university, classmates, professors. Others came ready to see a spectacle, eager to believe the narrative that Emma was a manipulator, using her disability to gain privileges. The judge, an older man with weary eyes and a tight mouth, took his seat as the clerk called the room to order. And then, like clockwork, Margaret Richardson was called to the stand. She walked slowly, deliberately, dressed in a dark grey business suit, her hair perfectly arranged, her demeanor calm and composed. She introduced herself with authority, as if she were testifying in front of a Senate subcommittee. I've served as president of the Sunset Valley Homeowners Association for over 8 years, she said. We pride ourselves on maintaining order and decorum. Our community has rules for a reason. She then launched into a detailed account of that night, twisting every moment, every word, into something sinister. According to her, she had simply asked Emma to respect the after-hours policy. She claimed Emma had become belligerent, entitled, and threatening. She quoted Emma's line, "You don't want to make this a bigger problem," as if it were a direct threat of violence. She said Emma had charged the gatehouse, causing significant structural damage. She said she feared for her safety, that the community feared what Emma might do next. It was a performance so polished, so rehearsed, that I saw people in the audience begin to nod. Then came the prosecutor's display. He presented the grainy video like it was the Zapruder film, pausing it at random moments to highlight aggression that didn't exist. He showed photos of the gatehouse close-ups of a minor crack in a wooden beam that predated Emma's arrival but had conveniently resurfaced in the last HOA report. And he hammered home the same narrative, that Emma used her disability as a shield to hide bad behavior, that allowing her to get away with this would set a precedent of lawlessness disguised as accommodation. I gripped the bench in front of me so tightly my knuckles went white. He was using bigotry as policy, and he was doing it confidently, unapologetically. But then it was our turn. Helen stood up calmly, walked to the center of the room, and began what I can only describe as a quiet demolition of Margaret's entire facade. "Mrs. Richardson," she began, "you testified that the handicap entrance has time restrictions. Can you direct us to the page in the HOA bylaws that states this policy?" Margaret blinked. "It's an understood rule," she said. "Understood by whom?" Helen asked. "Were residents ever given written notification? Was this rule ever included in the welcome packet?" Margaret shifted in her chair. "All residents are expected to adhere to reasonable community standards." Helen paused, then pressed harder. "Are you aware, Mrs. Richardson, that federal law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, requires 24 7 access to handicap entrances in residential communities. Are you stating that HOA rules override federal law? I didn't say that, Margaret snapped. I said our community has standards. Standards that prevent a disabled woman from accessing her home? Helen asked, letting the words hang in the air. Margaret faltered. The room shifted. People started looking at her differently. Then Helen brought up the witness statements. She pointed out the identical phrasing, the inconsistencies in the timeline, the absence of any real proof. Then she walked over to the video screen, played the clip, slowed it down, pointed out how Emma's chair got stuck, how she reached down gently, how the gatehouse barely moved. She asked the room, "Does this look like an attack to you? Or does this look like someone trying to get home while being blocked by someone on a power trip?" Margaret's confidence began to crumble. But the moment that truly turned the room was when Helen asked, "Do you believe disabled individuals should follow the same rules as everyone else, even when those rules prevent them from accessing basic needs like shelter?" Margaret, flustered, replied, "I believe in equal treatment." And Helen leaned in. "Even if equal treatment creates unequal outcomes?" Margaret had no answer. She didn't understand the question. And that, more than anything, proved our point. This case wasn't about law, it was about power, about a woman who didn't believe disabled people had the right to exist outside her narrow definition of normal. And now, under oath, she had said so plainly for the court to hear. The tide was turning, but we were only getting started, because when Emma finally took the stand, everything changed. Emma wheeled herself to the witness stand slowly, her head held high even though I could see the nerves in her eyes. The bailiff offered to help her, and she politely declined, as she always did. Independent to her core. When she was sworn in, there was a moment of stillness in the courtroom, not out of courtesy, but because everyone, including the judge, had stopped to really look at her. Not the villain painted by the prosecution, not the reckless, unhinged, disabled menace Margaret Richardson had tried to conjure, just a tired, brave young woman with a quiet dignity that filled the room. When asked to describe the events of the night, Emma spoke with a clarity and honesty that silenced even the most skeptical faces in the crowd. "I was coming home from my evening class. I use the handicap gate every day because the main entrance has stairs. It's the only way I can get home. I didn't know there was any time restriction because there isn't. I've never seen anything in writing, never heard anything from the HOA. That night, I just wanted to get to my apartment, shower, and work on a paper. But Mrs. Richardson was waiting for me." She paused, took a deep breath, and continued. "She told me I couldn't come in, that the gate was closed after 6 p.m. I asked her why, and she just said, 'Rules are rules.' I told her I had a legal right to access, showed her the ADA website on my phone, but she wasn't interested in listening. She said I was being disrespectful, that I thought I was special. Then she stood in front of my chair so I couldn't pass." Emma's voice wavered slightly at that point, but she pressed on. I asked her twice nicely to move. She refused. I tried to go around her carefully, but my wheel got caught on the edge of the gatepost. When I backed up, the post wobbled. That's all. No crashing, no braking, just a wobble. And she started screaming that I was attacking the property, that I was dangerous. Then she called the police. I was so confused. I thought maybe she'd finally lost her temper. But then the police showed up, and when they started questioning me, like I was a threat, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a setup. When the prosecutor asked if she had threatened Margaret, Emma didn't hesitate. "No, I would never threaten anyone." I said she didn't want to make this a bigger problem, and I meant legally, like with a discrimination complaint. I wasn't trying to scare her. I was just trying to go home. The courtroom was silent. For the first time, the judge seemed genuinely moved. The prosecutor shuffled his notes, clearly off balance. And then Emma said something that cut through the air like a blade. "I didn't ask to be disabled. I didn't ask for special treatment. I just want the same access to my home that everyone else has. If that makes me a criminal, then the law is broken." There wasn't a dry eye on our side of the room, and even a few of the jurors looked visibly shaken. But just when we thought the storm had passed, Margaret Richardson's legal team threw one last twist into the proceedings. They called District Attorney Paul Williams to the stand. Apparently, he had personally authorized the charges and was eager to defend the prosecution's position. He walked up confidently, projecting authority like a man who had delivered 100 closing arguments. "This case," he began, "is about accountability. We cannot allow individuals disabled or not to weaponize sympathy and use it to escape responsibility. Miss Morgan may have physical limitations, but that does not excuse destructive behavior. If we let this go, we set a dangerous precedent that anyone with a medical condition can claim discrimination when confronted for breaking the rules." He wasn't just speaking to the judge, he was grandstanding, positioning himself for a promotion or maybe the next election. His entire testimony was laced with political ambition, not legal principle. I watched him twist Emma's actions into acts of rebellion, her frustration into hostility, her simple words into veiled threats, and with each sentence, my rage built to a quiet boil. When he said, "Disability should not be a shield for criminal activity," I stood. I had stayed silent through the trial, hadn't thrown my weight around, hadn't pulled rank. But that moment when the most powerful legal figure in the county accused my daughter of exploiting her disability broke something in me. I stood in that courtroom and spoke with a voice that silenced the room. "Your Honor," I said, "I am Robert Morgan, United States Attorney General, and I am also the father of the young woman this courtroom has vilified for the last 3 days." Gasps echoed through the chamber. Margaret turned pale. Williams froze like a statue. "I've prosecuted international cartels, domestic terrorists, political corruption, and I've never seen a case as reckless, cruel, and unethical as this one. What we have here is a community punishing a woman not for what she did, but for who she is. A disabled woman who dared to live independently, to ask for basic access, and to push back against being treated like an inconvenience." I turned toward Margaret. "You have harassed my daughter since the day she moved in. You've policed her wheelchair ramp, her parking spot, the sound of her wheels on pavement. And when she didn't crumble, you called the police and tried to bury her under criminal charges. You didn't know who she was, but that shouldn't matter. Because every disabled person deserves protection, not because of who they are related to, but because it is the law." I turned to the judge. "I formally request that all charges be dropped immediately. This prosecution is based not on evidence, but on bias. And I intend to open a full federal investigation into the Sunset Valley HOA and the conduct of the district attorney's office." There was nothing more to say. The judge looked at DA Williams, then back at me, then down at his bench. "Mr. Williams," he said, "in light of these revelations, do you wish to proceed?" Williams, visibly sweating now, mumbled something about reconsideration. The judge didn't wait. "Charges against Miss Morgan are hereby dismissed. Furthermore, I'm ordering an ethics review of this prosecution. Court is adjourned." In the weeks that followed, the Department of Justice filed a civil suit against Sunset Valley HOA. The investigation uncovered a disturbing pattern of discrimination against not just Emma, but other disabled residents who had quietly moved away after being harassed or fined into submission. Margaret Richardson was removed from her position and ordered to pay damages. Several board members resigned in disgrace. DA Williams was publicly censured and stripped of prosecutorial authority pending a disciplinary hearing, but none of that compared to what Emma gained. She was invited to speak at disability rights conferences. Her story was picked up by major networks, sparking national conversations about HOA abuse and civil rights. She graduated with honors and accepted a position at the EPA, working to identify and challenge environmental discrimination in marginalized communities. She still lives in Sunset Valley, not because she has to, but because she chose to. And now, no one dares treat her like she doesn't belong. One afternoon, she sat beside me on the porch and said, "Dad, remember when Margaret said I expected special treatment?" I nodded. She looked ahead, the sun catching the side of her face. She was right. I do expect special treatment. I expect to be treated like a human being, with dignity, with fairness. If that's special, then this world needs a whole lot more of it. And she was right. The real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the change her courage forced into motion. Emma didn't just win her case. She made the system acknowledge her existence, her worth, her rights. And the next time someone like Margaret Richardson tries to silence another Emma, they'll think twice because they'll know that justice will show up. And it might just come with a daughter in a wheelchair, and a father who never backs down.